right. Got it. Yep. Got it. There we go.
All right. So today we are talking about big men, beasts, all of the giants in professional wrestling throughout history, currently walking around the ring today, and maybe ones that are walking around but not quite in the ring yet. So I had messaged you. I think it was just yesterday when I was doing a lot of research and asked, "What is your definition of a big man in wrestling?" Start us off with that. What is, for the purposes of this episode, a big man in wrestling?
Big man in wrestling could be many things. It could be big in stature, or it can be big as in really tall, really gigantic. Really, what they call them head turners, where basically you are in an airport, say, and big guy just walks past. I don't care what kind of big guy it is. If he's playing professional anything, it could be professional wrestling, it could be professional basketball, it could be anything, or just a giant man. I am willing to bet dollars to donuts that people will just do one of these. You know what I mean? Men, women, and children will always do that, because anybody who's really tall always gets attention.
Yeah.
I don't care who you are. So,
Yep. And for a lot of guys, especially I think in the mind of Vince McMahon, all they needed to do was just be tall. It didn't matter if they were talented. It didn't matter if they could perform. And in some instances, it didn't matter if they were hurting other people. They were a draw, and Vince was going to try to jam them through the formula that he's had for big, successful men and women in some instances in wrestling. And
yeah. Not a lot of tall women in wrestling. Sadly, they've had a couple. They had one in NXT Black and Gold a couple of years back. Well, actually, I would say 10 years back.
Eloisa.
Yeah, Eloisa, Isis the Amazon. Yeah, she was ginormous. I have a picture next to her, and my gosh, I literally come up to her boobs. That's how short. Because I'm 5'7" and three,
Yeah.
5'7" and 3/4. I'm not quite 5'8". So I was robbed that little quarter inch. But the point being is I'm up to her boobs in the picture, so that'll give you an idea of how tall this woman was. So
Yeah, I believe she was a legitimate 6'9".
I believe it. Yeah. I remember seeing her in person, and I was like, oh, wow, I couldn't believe it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. She's a looker too. Not that you can't be a tall woman and not be attractive or easy on the eyes, not to belittle somebody, but I've run into a small little group of women. I'm here in Utah, and so I've literally bumped into the BYU women's basketball team. One of my good neighbors down the road, his daughter is currently on the BYU women's basketball team, and I think probably more so with women than men. There's usually something that's not proportionate that makes them kind of get maybe like a second glance, and you do see this with some men too. But Isis the Amazon, it looks like when she was kind of stamped out, they just cranked the volume up, and poof, there she was.
Yeah, very, very, very tall, that woman.
Yeah.
I just remember that. I was like, and I over the years I've met a lot of really tall, short, and big and small wrestlers, and man, that was one of the more impressive things I ever saw.
Yeah, and I think it, at least in the WWE, Nia Jax, again, not always trying to draw parallels between the women's division and the men's division, but she kind of filled the role that like the Big Show would fill. And part of the reason I say that is that there's a famous spot in every Royal Rumble. It was with Big Show. If there is maybe a battle royal with Andre, they all get on there. They just unleash. People go flying. And I've seen Nia Jax used in that spot in the WWE quite a few times too.
Yeah, a crazy strength on that woman. Man, and she what I liked about her, same reason I liked about Awesome Kong when she was active, was they pulled no punches. They were stiff. And
Yep.
you out of somebody that ginormous, you expect them to be as stiff as they look. So
Yeah.
uh where I don't know where the surprise came in. It's like, oh, Nia Jax is stiff. She don't know how to work. And I'm like, no, I don't think so because she is Samoan, so she definitely knows how to work. She
Yeah.
was just working with the gimmick that was given to her. This big, glamazon ass kicker kind of,
Yeah.
and very much in the spirit of Awesome Kong. Awesome Kong, same thing. You never heard Gail Kim, who was one of the smallest women on the roster, ever complain about how stiff she was. She just said, "Hey, we revolutionized the women's division in TNA,
Yep.
and we had some of the greatest matches. I'm sure they were rough, but again, you never heard Gail Kim complain. So that's
That
all
is
I'm saying."
very true. Yeah. And I think, like you said, whatever the role was for them, if they're supposed to be these big, unstoppable uh, beasts just tearing through everybody, it's a lot easier to sell if that's
Yeah.
what is really happening in the ring. As I think, well, I know for a fact Charlotte Flair found out at least once from Nia Jax.
Well, again, what do you expect? You have somebody who is on the level of Charlotte who can be as smooth as silk when she wants to be, which is almost always, right?
Yeah.
And here is this big beast of a woman, Nia Jax, like, hey, I'm an ass kicker. What do you expect? I'm just saying. Like, did you expect a different result than what we got? You know,
Yeah.
at least I will say this. At least when it happened to Becky Lynch, when she got knocked right in the nose on accident, she used it to her advantage, and she got the biggest push of her career.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I think both her and Charlotte are pros through and through. But with Nia and Charlotte, there was a match last year. Um, I'm pretty sure it was on Raw.
Hmm.
That's been examined. I mean, even Mick Foley tweeted about it. Every smart mark with a keyboard is kind of dissecting it. But I heard Jim Cornette kind of go through it. Mick Foley tweeted about it. You could
Hmm.
see very clearly, for whatever reason, and I'm not sure which one of them started it, but they're starting to go into business for themselves, and it was very brutal.
Yeah, and was this the case of I have to laugh because I just think we were talking about Shawn Michaels off the air. Now
Yeah.
Shawn Michaels and Vader from SummerSlam '96. Move, asshole! Move, asshole!
Yep.
You know, like that's what that moment between Charlotte and Nia there reminded me completely of that for whatever reason it was. Yeah, I flash back to that.
No, and that's true. And poor Vader, I really do think that was the end of his push and his run in
It
the
was.
WWF at the time.
It was documented that it was. So
Yeah, he would never recover from that.
no, no, and he was supposed to have the long, drawn out program with Sean. That's why that December pay per view was called It's Time, was because that was built around Vader. They were supposed to do a best of three series, Sean and Vader, to get to Royal Rumble, where ultimately Sean would end up with the belt again because they knew this was back when WWF was booking backwards, so they knew they were going to San Antonio to the Alamo Dome.
Yeah.
So they had this all in place way before that even happened. But of course, that one match,
Well, that and Vader's little incident in Kuwait, I don't think uh, garnered him any support from the company either.
well, WWF didn't help matters by keeping him over there. I don't know if that was a rib or whatever, but
I heard Bruce Pritchard say that he was on some form of house arrest. He could not leave the hotel he was at, and he was there for, I think it was only like 8 or 9 days, but he was calling back. And again, Bruce is the company guy.
Yep.
But even taking that into consideration, I think it's probably true. Vader did not like being stuck there. The the gravity of how things like that go over in the uh, uh, countries over there is a lot different than stuff that goes on here.
Oh yeah, I just think in the same vein, another big man in his own right, Scott Norton, being stuck in North Korea for that collision in Korea.
That's right. I forgot about that.
Where he's talking to his wife on the phone saying, "This place sucks, we have nothing here," and yada yada. All of a sudden, click, and he has the North Korean police slash army, whatever they have over there.
Yeah.
It's very much under communism over there, and Scott Norton was very lucky to get out alive from that incident. Yeah, they cut his phone and went into his hotel room and everything. So another story for another time, but yeah.
I think that would be a good episode. Wrestlers and the countries who hate them.
Do you know how many times I've heard about wrestlers in Japan having at it with the Yakuza? You know what I mean? Like where they slip up somehow, and they get out of line with the Yakuza, and the Yakuza almost freaking kills them. I've probably heard at least a dozen stories. So
yeah. Kind of going off of that, we've kind of been dancing around with a lot of really good examples of some of the more classic and historic big men in wrestling.
All started with tall women.
Yeah. Well, and because we definitely want to give full respect and time to women that fit the role and have done really well. There aren't that many, and to be fair to everyone, a legitimate women's division is very much a modern invention that does not have a long and storied history yet. So
no, and I'm happy to see that this division of, and it's the one thing professional wrestling has gotten right, I would say, within the last 10 years, is establishing this division going forward. Because again, I've said it in previous episodes and I mean it, the women athletes that they have are not only real athletes, but also some of the best athletes, period, in pro wrestling.
yes.
Never mind men, women, children, babies, whatever,
Yeah.
In all seriousness, it's a division that not only should be taken seriously, but I'm glad is.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can see matches with I really like Charlotte. I think a lot of people really like Charlotte. If I had to grab someone who wasn't in the role that like Becky Lynch and Charlotte's in, I like Sasha Banks quite a bit. Bianca Belair are truly incredible. Like these are people that can main event WrestleMania and pull it off, and it's not a gimmick. It's not a rib, and I definitely think that is, like you said, something that wrestling has gotten right. One more little sidetrack for us. I can remember watching the finals of the women's tag team championship tournament, and it was Bailey and Sasha, if I'm not mistaken, right?
Yeah, they were the first champions, I think.
Yeah, they were the inaugural. Yeah. And I remember watching it, and like I did have kind of goosebumps, and like they were kind of tearing up. It was one of those times where you really were watching a part of wrestling history unfold that rarely happens. And just because the WWE doesn't know how to book a tag team division is not a reflection on the performance of the women in their division. But I remember watching that like, wow, this is amazing. And there have been lots of women who have come and gone, and some that are still there today that
Mhm.
I think rightly are revered for their accomplishments and for their performance. I just remember watching that, and it was one of those moments like, wow, like I saw Taka Michinoku win the light heavyweight title. I saw the birth of the Austin era, and even if the women's tag team championship um, uh, isn't booked the way it should be, like I said, that is no reflection at all on the women who are there. But that was a very significant and really important moment in wrestling history.
Also understated was the Evolution pay-per-view, which has a mixed bag of reviews, but the purpose of that pay-per-view was they had so many good women on the roster at the time that they had enough to headline their own pay-per-view. You know, when does that ever happen? In especially in WWE history, when does that happen?
Yeah,
Never until now. You know, and I think a lot of credit has to go to uh, how those women were trained in NXT and their backgrounds otherwise, coming from the independents, coming from TNA, coming from wherever they were coming from. Also, to a lot of those women too were cut from the Fit Finley cloth as well.
yeah,
So Fit is an unsung hero to those women, and he wanted to establish that division back in the early 2000s, and of course, you know, we were in a different climate back then, so it couldn't get off the ground past brawn panties and lingerie
yeah.
pillow matches, sadly, or 3 minute bathroom matches, you know. And it's a subject I'd love to explore because, man, it deserves its own show. It really does.
Well, and the very first time we ever recorded and I went back and watched, we've had a list for the women's division on my uh, uh, episode list. I just haven't gotten around. Well, and we don't have a super long roadmap planned out, but yeah, that's definitely worth its own episode and worth the time to go through. And
Absolutely.
yeah, so Isis, Aloisa,
Yep.
in the women's division. When how can you even talk about this without going right to Andre?
Yes, I can. I can talk about it in the sense that, well, again, just like how I was saying, how a lot of professional wrestling has a lot of thanks to do with the carnival circuit, you know, and a lot of the stuff that we know of today with the but in this case, we're talking about big men, big in stature and big in height. We're talking the freak show more specifically. So, and you know, every freak show in the circus has that world's either the world's strongest man, the world's fattest man, the world's tallest man, you name it. So it can definitely be traced back there. Um, One of the earliest attractions was a guy by the name of Maurice Toulette, who was the French Angel, if you remember.
Yes,
And he was a big name, and he actually was the inspiration behind Shrek, the movie character Shrek. He's the inspiration behind it.
that I didn't
Um,
know.
yeah, you can Google images side by side. It's pretty uncanny, but he had the same disease as Andre, but the only difference was it affected his head, hands, and feet. So he uh he was an average sized guy, meaning like he was 5'9". So, but he had ginormous head, ginormous hands, ginormous feet. So they marketed him as such, as being like the world's ugliest wrestler, you know?
Yeah, yeah, we're
But
talking about acromegaly.
yep.
Uh, Andre famously had it.
Hmm.
Big Show did as well,
Yep.
which we'll get to.
Yep. And Big Show had the surgery to correct it when he was younger, so
Yep.
he can still live and be 50 years old, and
They didn't
uh,
have that surgery when Andre was alive. They did not.
no. And to be fair, medical science wasn't what it is now,
Mhm.
or wasn't even what it was in the 90s even, because you think Big Show had it what right either right before or right after Andre passed.
Yeah,
So
Big Show was 18 or 19 when he had it. They go up through the nose. So he was gonna, for the most part, stop growing. Part of the reason it affected Andre so much different than Big Show is because they did have their surgery. But like in Andre's case, from what I understand, you literally just keep growing. Your bones keep going. Your heart keeps going is as well, and your body just grows to a point to where it can't support itself. I'm sure that's kind of a crude um, uh, definition of how acromegaly or gigantism affects us, but for the purpose of our episode, I think that is sufficient.
yep, and same thing with Maurice Delay. He died of heart-related issues when and he was not very old when he passed, and died. I think he lived from the early 1900s to about maybe 1950 or so. So
Mhm.
he didn't last very, very long. And after him, well, actually, rewind back just a bit. So him being the French Angel inspired a lot of other angels in pro wrestling, which were basically like the freak shows, shave your head, and if you have anything freaky about you, they would accentuate that promotion wise. The
Mhm.
most famous to spawn out of him was the Super Swedish Angel, which was played by Tor Johnson. Tor Johnson, you might know, he's the most famous. He's probably one of the most famous Halloween masks ever. It's the bald guy, zombie look. Like that kind of look. That's Tor Johnson. It's a famous Don Post mask. You can Google it. Also, he starred in all the Ed Wood movies. So uh, that's how he and got into Hollywood very, after his wrestling career kind of went, you know,
Yeah,
and later actually in the Johnny Depp film was played by George Animal Steel, who was an attraction in his own right, and a big man in his own right.
yeah,
But yeah, but Tor Johnson, the Super Swedish Angel, he was probably the second, I would say, big name attraction that made it, you know. And then third, I can think of right off the top of my head, and you may know them. I know them from browsing through the old Guinness Book of World Records. Was the McGuire twins?
yep.
Do you remember the McGuire twins?
I sure do. It's a famous picture of them on their little mopeds.
Mm-hmm.
Yep,
Yeah, they were briefly in pro wrestling.
I did
Believe
not
it
know
or
that.
not, yeah, believe it or they were used as attractions because of what else were they going to use them for, right? And believe it or not, they got some training from Eddie Guerrero's dad, Gory Guerrero.
Wow.
Found that out in my research, and I was like, really, Gory
Yeah.
Guerrero? He must have just shown them the fine basics because wrestling wonders they were not. They literally splashed and rolled on you. I mean, what else are you going to do after
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. And for guys like that, for the attraction matches that they held, they really didn't need to do a whole lot.
But attraction matches actually, and like freak show sideshow matches actually came because of the war. Because a lot of guys went off to the war, that were healthy, and the ones that were left behind were ones with medical conditions. Hence, the freak shows being used in pro wrestling. Same
Mhm.
with the women being used in pro wrestling because the women were left behind as well. So the war, those were like the biggest attractions back then. So, and what people were actually paying to see.
Yeah. So what was Andre's gimmick when he wore the mask? I can't
He
remember
was
his
the
name.
giant machine.
There we go.
Yep.
A&E did a little episode, but that was the one with Mark Henry and Big Show. They were looking for Andre's back brace. Was that the same one where they tracked down the mask he wore? Do you know?
Yeah, and Sonny Ono tries to play used car salesman on
That
yeah, and that did not go over well with Big Show and Mark Henry.
no, I remember Mark Henry had to go step outside and
Why do
have a breather.
like I said in another episode, why do people mess with Mark Henry? Like really, why?
Well, and I do have him marked down on our list, but um, I and maybe you have more of an insight into this, and we can talk about it later. But the Phantom match that he went out for that was never booked, where it was a rib, where he went out to the ring and they had already stopped taping, and there wasn't a match. He was just brought out there to look silly.
You talking Mark Henry?
Yeah,
Was that early in his career?
yeah. Let me see here. Hang on. So we had Big Show and Mark Henry hunting down Andre's machine mask, and
Yeah.
Sonny was playing hardball with him, and Mark was getting pretty upset.
Yeah, and he had to leave the room. And once again, it's another situation where someone pisses off Mark Henry to the point where Mark Henry wants to kill him, and
Yeah,
cooler heads prevail. So
yeah. And we just had a good little off-screen recap of when Henry was booked in, well, a joke match. They brought him out to the ring. He was supposed to wrestle Sin Cara, and it was all a rip. They were recording for fun, but there was no match, and it wasn't going to be broadcasted. And Mark went backstage, and we just heard him talk about being like Darth Vader and just destroying everything around him.
I wonder if he can do that thing with his hand where he can just choke somebody from afar.
Force
If
choke.
if I can, yeah, if I can believe anybody can do that, Mark Henry can probably do that. Jedi mind
Yeah,
trick choke. Yeah,
yeah, force choke.
force using the force.
Yeah. Um, so we have Andre. Was Andre able to put a mask on and really get over as someone else
No,
back in
because
those times?
how the hell are you going to hide Andre the Giant? How do you hide someone with that stature and that physique? Now his partner, which was Bill Eadie, Demolition Axe, you can hide him because think about it. I mean, before he was Demolition Axe, he was the Masked Superstar, so
Mhm.
he was already hiding in a mask for years before he even portrayed that machine character. And so it was a little bit easier for him to hide. Um,
Who was the
uh,
original Smash?
that would be Randy Colley, the Moondog Spot.
Yeah,
Oh
and
no,
then
no, Moondog Rex. Moondog Spot was the other one. I always confuse those two, but Spot and Rex, but oh, Moondog Rex, Randy Colley. Yeah.
he wasn't able to get away with it, and so Barry Darso took up the mantle of Smash, from what I understand.
Yeah. Well, because and that was more of a Bill Eadie call because he wanted somebody different and somebody nobody had really seen. And you think about it, Barry Darso in NWA at the time was Crusher Khrushchev. His head was shaved. You wouldn't have even known who he was had you not recognized the little tattoo that he had. He grew his hair out, and he looked actually very similar to Axe in the beginning because his hair was
It
very
was just
short.
slick back, if I remember.
Yeah, and he let it grow out. So it's and actually, if you remember, because even the Hasbro figure had it, where the elbow pad was up higher, so it would cover the tattoo.
I did not
Uh,
know that.
Demolition Smash. Yeah. The action figure even had it, I remember. And yeah, they he tried covering that up, and eventually, the elbow pad went down lower, and you saw the full. And then when he became the Repo Man, he added to the tattoo, so you wouldn't recognize it was him. But I mean,
Yeah,
clearly it was.
I
You
mean,
can't. Can't fake that promo.
No,
So
I mean, we were maybe 10 when he became Repo Man. So as a kid, um, I know you were a huge mark for Demolition. I was as well,
oh
but
yeah.
just maybe being a little bit too young and not even close to being wise to the business, I had no idea until way later on that Demolition Smash was Repo Man.
I was a very curious kid, so I was like, like same tattoo in the same place. Looks a little skinnier, but yeah, this could be Smash.
Yeah,
So
yeah. No, I was a very uh, dense kid. I was not being able to pick up on subtle or not so subtle hints. It's like, oh, hey, here is this. It was really easy for me to uh, suspend my disbelief and kind of go along with it. I enjoyed the storylines quite a bit.
yeah, yeah.
So you have Andre going around as Andre, and then you'll probably know this better than myself, but the reason, because he was with Vince Sr. when he did his machine gimmick, correct?
Yeah, no, maybe because the machine gimmick was done over in Japan before it was done here.
Yeah.
So, but when it was done in the States, that was Vince Jr. Because Andre was on a suspension at the time. So,
Yeah. And so that's why they put the mask on him to get
right.
away.
And
Yeah.
Bobby Heenan was trying to disprove, like, hey, that's actually Andre the Giant under there. And then Andre in his French accent would do a Japanese saying, along with Bill Eadie would also, and you can't hide the voice nor the body. So it's like, it's
Yeah.
clear. It was one of those, it was like Dusty as the Midnight Rider, where he would come back, hey, loser leaves town for 60 days, but Dusty puts on the mask and then he does a little peek. It's me. Hogan did the same thing with Mr. America.
I know.
Same.
I love that.
Oh, that was great when Hogan passed the lie detector test as Mr. America, where he denied he was Hulk Hogan,
Hmm.
which
Yeah.
it which considering and I'm the biggest Hogan fan in the world, but considering how much Hogan likes to embellish things, um, him passing a lie detector test is not too far from the truth.
Yeah.
But it
All
was
right.
great. Yeah, but yes, Andre. But even going back, when he first came to the States back in the, because he came, actually where he was primarily booked first was Montreal. Eduardo Carpentier, Edward Carpentier, or Eduardo Carpentier. It's basically Ed Carpenter. You know what I mean? It's a fancier way of saying that. But he was a French Canadian wrestler, and he took Andre under his wing and ended up training Andre uh, and bringing him to Montreal, where Andre got his first fame as Jean Ferry, and he was going back and forth between that and Tokyo,
Yeah.
or yeah, Japan in the beginning, where he was Monster Rusinov and used pretty good there because, of course, back then, I mean, besides Giant Baba, I mean, where do you see a 7 foot whatever guy,
Yeah.
back then? And you got to think, Andre was young. He was probably in his 20s then.
I think it
So
was his early 20s by the time he'd made it to Canada.
still tall, but much skinnier and could move in the ring, like very,
Yeah.
very good. Like he was a smaller guy. But yeah, his where he became famous was Montreal. And then Vince Sr. saw him and thought money, of course. So Vince Senior, he brought him to New York, and Vince Senior became his booking agent, and that's where you get Andre in the territory system, because in Montreal he was kind of being burnt out, meaning like he was there so often that people almost took him for granted. You know what I mean? Like not being treated like the attraction that he could have been. That's where Vince Senior saw money. Was like,
Yeah.
hey, we can book him in New York, but we can also book him here for 2 months, or here for a week, or here for 3 weeks, or whatever. You know what I mean? And Vince Senior was still in good with all the promoters, unlike Vince Junior later on. but
Yeah.
he um would book him out, and he would literally go all over the world, and his attraction stayed up, his money stayed up. Like I said, the guy was raking in $400,000 back in the late 70s, early 80s money, which that was a lot of money back then, you
Yeah.
know.
And I remember on our previous episode, we talked about Flair and a traveling champion. Everything I've read is that Andre, just being the attraction of this very real giant, was booked around very much like a traveling champion.
Yeah, yeah, same deal and everything. Because Andre was money, and the house would always jump because, again, who doesn't want to see a 7'4" tall man? You know what I mean? Like, who
Mhm.
doesn't want to see somebody like that live? And especially because if you go to say Oklahoma, I mean, how often do they see a 7'4" Frenchman?
Not often.
Not often, maybe in Louisiana, you know what I mean, where it's Cajun country, maybe.
Oh yeah.
But
Yeah, you could
um
pull someone out of the swamp and
right, but I'm willing to bet no. Nowadays you never know, but back then, no. you
yeah.
know
So Andre is touring, doing really well, and I have seen footage of him from the 70s. He was actually pretty graceful. The Andre that I grew up and accustomed to seeing and performing was WrestleMania 3 type of Andre, who I definitely didn't know at the time, but was in a lot of pain and was very limited to what he could do, but still, I mean, yeah, Hogan did a lot in that match for sure. And I think Hogan was able to do a lot more in his career than he's generally given credit for. But Andre still had to be Andre. And still, I think when I was a kid watching him around the WrestleMania 3 timeframe, was still performing incredibly, especially all things considered with his health.
Yeah, and where it came was, at first Vince was using him very sparingly. Vince Jr. now was using him sparingly at the time, because if you notice, he there was a lot of promos leading up to WrestleMania 3, but not you notice Andre did not wrestle a lot at all. In fact, he had kind of like a Hogan type schedule where he would make TV appearances, but he would not wrestle on television. So that was very important at the time. Now, the same can't be said for when he started doing house show, like he was on the house show run. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Because unless you had the MSG network or whatever, or Nesson, you didn't really see Andre
Yeah.
on television. Maybe once in a while on like a Superstars match, but you really he was treated along the same as Hogan at first, where it became burnt out with him with Vince Jr., meaning like almost the same as like when they saw him in his younger days in Montreal, was the amount of television that was on what I mean, where WWF was expanding their syndication reach and their cable reach. Was now all of a sudden you could see Andre the Giant on television every week,
Yeah.
in
This is
some form.
exactly what we talked about in our media episode too.
Right, and that combined with Andre's outside habits, kind of, because he knew he already lived more than half his life already.
Yeah.
So, and he just went out, he went out swinging basically, and just partied every night. So that started to catch up with him, and also his disease, because again, we talked about earlier how he wouldn't stop growing in his
Yeah.
features there, and he just looked way older before his time. I mean, Andre died when he was
40,
43, or was
43
he
or
40,
46. I think it was
43?
46.
Was he 46?
I
Okay.
think so.
So, yeah, I stand corrected. But he did not look 46. He looked pretty goddamn older than that. He looked like a guy, I would say, in his mid 50s, approaching his 60s facially by
Yeah.
that time, you know? And yeah, it wasn't a good look, you know?
No, and you uh, did have the attraction, but going back to our media episode again, the business was changing along with technology, and figuring out what to do with Andre at that point um, may have been harder for at least Vince Jr. than maybe it should have been.
Yeah, because they even tried for a piece, and his joints had gotten so bad. I remember they tried for a piece, even making a management, like just coming out and with whoever, you know what I mean. Typically, he was either with the Bushwhackers. I remember one time he came out with Davy Boy Smith on like it was one of those like UK shows that they had back in the day. Um, so like there's only so many guys he can come out with, and I think he had a little bit of yes, he had a little bit of involvement in WrestleMania 7. I do remember with the Intercontinental title match, which oh man, I think everyone involved in that match is dead now, which is so sad to think about. but
Yes.
yeah, but yeah, there's only so many run-ins and so many guys he can come out with, and plus. Nothing against the Bushwhackers. I love the Bushwhackers, but you're going to put Andre the Giant, this guy you've been marketing for years, being this imposing, this intimidating guy with the Bushwhackers of all people. And Andre also had those crutches at the time, if you remember, where
I
the
do.
race crutches.
Yep.
So that wasn't a good look for Andre, I felt.
No,
It
and
was,
and they even had that spot where Earthquake hit him with the megaphone to try to give a on-screen or kayfabe reason for him to be on crutches. But
yeah, yeah, no, it's okay, so the early 80s when he broke his ankle or broke his leg there, supposedly Killer Khan did it in the ring. Andre actually did it getting out of bed. So, because his joints were getting bad back
yeah,
in 1983. So he was out. Actually, Vince still has that life-size cast that
yeah,
Andre wore.
yep,
And yeah, that I they used to pull that out every WrestleMania Access. I've never seen it. I can only imagine it's you know
yeah. Well, I mean, even looking at like his boot, or they have the imprints of his hand that you can go up and put your hand in there, get your picture taken with him. I mean, I would imagine his leg cast. I could probably fit my kid in it.
yeah. I remember it was in an interview with Stephanie McMahon saying her wrists were so small, like one of Andre's rings almost fit around it when she was a kid.
Yep.
So
So around this time too, to uh, get a really kind of comprehensive picture of Andre, the Princess Bride,
yep,
as two guys who were born in the early 80s and grew up in the 90s. The Princess Bride probably probably meant more to us because we also knew and loved Andre outside of it. But if you're looking for a fee fi fo kind of giant in a fairy tale movie, you are not going to find a better guy to fill that role than Andre.
no, perfect movie for him. Heard he was in a lot of pain when he did that movie because that was like the height of like his back pain right before he got the surgery to kind of alleviate some of that, where
Yeah,
he could get into WrestleMania 3. But you know what? Knowing how much pain he was actually going through while filming that, it's very commendable that he was
yeah,
able to pull that role off as well as he did.
yep,
So, and hey, everyone's better for it. If you don't even know Andre the Giant from pro wrestling, you definitely know him from The Princess Bride. You can ask, and it's a big popular movie with, especially with the ladies. You know what I mean? For
yeah.
sure. I love the movie as well. One of my girlfriend's favorite movies, also. In fact, she has a Princess Bride inspired tattoo on her. That's how much she loves the movie. But
That's fantastic.
yeah, yeah, and and she knew. And funny enough, before she met me, she knew of wrestling, of course. Everybody did in the '80s, just like I did, where or you did, where even that was our gateway. But
Yeah.
she she more knew Andre from The Princess Bride than she did wrestling. So that speaks volumes to his talent.
Yeah.
You know.
Yep. And I've heard lots of stories because they had a big anniversary for that a couple of years ago, and a lot of the cast got together and told stories, and they recorded that, and I believe re-released the film
Mhm.
with like a mini documentary on it. I do know that one of the first nights they filmed, Andre, just like he would in the locker room with the boys, stayed up with the crew drinking, and they actually did have to cancel a day of shooting because Andre got everybody so wrecked that they weren't able to shoot the following day.
Oh man. You know what? I heard this story. Now, being a music guy, of course, and being an Ozzy Osbourne guy, which I am, and very much love Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. I'm a huge fan of both. Um, uh, Zach Wild, his on and off guitarist of about 30 something years, maybe longer now, but Zach Wild had said his audition when he was 18 years old. He was probably a 28-inch waist and skinny as a rail with this big hair, pre beard, of course, pre Viking look. He said his audition was at a bar for Ozzy, was at a bar where here's Andre the Giant and here's Ozzy Osbourne drinking at a bar. Can you imagine not only A, the bar tab, and B, how much alcohol was freaking consumed that day?
I did not know that at all.
Yeah, yeah, true story, true story. Uh, Zach Weil also happens to be the number one Ultimate Warrior fan, so
Mhm.
he says. So he's a big Ultimate Warrior guy.
Yeah, I can. I got my warrior shirt out for uh,
That's
this
what
week.
reminded me of it, and we were talking Andre, so yeah, but that's 100% true story. He said when he auditioned for Ozzy to be the guitarist, this was after, and music guys would know this. This was after Ultimate Sin, which came out in '86. So this had to have been a late '86, early '87 time period, maybe even mid '87. Who knows? But yeah, so Ozzy Osbourne, Andre the Giant, two guys walk into a bar.
Independent of each other.
Yeah, yeah, and two
That's
two guys
crazy.
two guys completely shut down the bar of all the booze in the bar.
Yep, that is. That's great. I have to look that up later and try to read
And
more
with
about that.
Ozzy, I mean, with all the other goodies he was doing in 1986, 1987, like on top of drinking.
Oh yeah.
So
Okay. So coming into the 90s more, Andre is kind of being relegated back to what he was in the beginning, a part-time attraction, um, trying to come up with clever ways to book him and to use him. Um, and everybody is entitled to their own opinion, but when you think of big men in wrestling, with all due respect to everyone before and after, Andre is the measuring stick, for better or
yes,
worse, for big men in wrestling.
yeah, and you know what? And I honestly believe he is because Andre loved the business. He wouldn't have stayed as long as he did if he didn't. So
Yeah,
even in that, we can state that he was shown later on in life. I don't think he would have stayed as long and had agreed to do so much had he not loved the business as much as he did.
yeah,
So while it pained me to see him like that, I was happy to see him on television. Does that make sense?
absolutely. Yeah,
And
you can still appreciate.
Yes,
whatever he
yes.
was able to put on that day.
And to summarize too, the 1980s when Andre the Giant was really being exposed to little kids like myself and you know, like that was the land of the big men. We had there was a lot of really big, really wide, really tall fellas. You know, even Hogan being 6'7" legitimately.
Yeah.
You know, this was of course before his spine collapsed on him, you know, from all the back surgeries and steroid use and whatever. Another big man that comes to mind real quick is Big John Studd, which
Yeah.
yeah, and Big John Studd was a legitimate. He was probably 6'8", I would say, but legitimately big. Big hands, big head. Go to find out actually, and this was documented actually in a Ken Patera shoot interview where he talked about John Studd, and Studd was one of the first wrestlers to use human growth hormone, and that's why he grew as large as he did, especially later in
As
life.
full as he was.
Yeah. So, and some say that contributed to his death. However, he died of Hodgkin's disease, so I don't see the correlation. But,
Yeah.
um, but John Studd, yet again, I mean, you know, if you don't know him from wrestling, you know him from Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man. You
And
know,
my
like
dad, how much did my dad love that movie? I mean, even you.
your dad was the part. he
Yeah.
could have he could have walked in central casting in that movie. To be honest,
Yeah.
Bruce definitely could have.
Yeah.
Especially when he was all bikered out with the you know the well they were skinny jeans before there was even a term, and cowboy boots and
Yeah.
the Harley Davidson regal shirts. Yeah, I could just picture him right now in my head. You know what I mean? His hair
I
was always parted perfect too, right down the middle.
Yep.
I remember that.
He
He had a,
very much was.
he
What's
had
that?
a long ponytail once too, right?
Yeah. I have pictures of that
Okay, because I
before
remember you
long
had the
before I was
tiny.
thought of.
Yeah, you had the tiny tail. He had the long. I remember he had a long ponytail at one point.
He did.
So
Yeah, and
yeah,
he was very much a part of that life legitimately. Then he spent some years in jail. In fact, right after I was born, is because he did escape from prison. Um, that is very much a true story. And then he met my mom when he was on the run, and she got pregnant with me, and my dad's mother was out in California, so they went out there. They have they get married in Vegas. My dad and a very pregnant mom with me, and then I'm born out there. And then they come back to Massachusetts, and a few months later, it's his birthday, and he gets drunk and wants my mom to make him an apple pie. So him, his brother, my uncle Charlie, who looked very similar, and my dad had a fake ID with him on there instead of my uncle Charlie because their physical features were very similar, and so they go out to a orchard, a private orchard, and they're filling up the trunk with apples. Um, so my mom can make him an apple pie. And then the police come out. And so my uncle Charlie has his ID, looks looks the part. My dad is wanting for not returning from a furlough from prison when his dad died, and his ID says Charlie as well.
hmm,
So he had to go back and finish finish his time in prison. But yeah, my dad looked that part that Big John Studd did, and Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man. Um,
yeah, yeah, and quite famous in his own right. I main evented against Hogan in the '80s, so I mean
yep,
he had himself a nice little run for quite a while. Him and Andre, from my understanding, him and Andre did not get along
that's what I
backstage.
understand as well.
Yeah, and I guess it wasn't that they didn't get along. I guess Andre was ribbing him for a lot of years.
Oh,
Uh, so I'm told, and John Studd just really couldn't take it. Like, I guess getting back to like Shawn Michaels, he had cited a similar story in his book about shaking Andre's hand and Andre blowing him off for like him and Janetti for a number of years, just always going and shaking his hand, and Andre just, I'm playing cribbage, whatever, right?
Yeah.
And Sean, I guess Marty gave up, but Sean refused never to give up, and then finally Andre shook his hand after so many years. So maybe that was Andre's way of ribbon Stud. I don't know, but
I had heard that there were things that John Studd did, like stepping over all the ropes, that Andre said, nope, this is my shtick. You don't do that. And so there was kind of a competition as to who was the big man in the locker room.
I've heard that also, and I've also heard that Stud basically took away from his specialness, meaning like Andre's specialness as like
Yeah.
being very tall, because Stud was almost as tall. You know what I mean? Andre was still taller than him, but it wasn't by much. And
Yeah.
it was very similar to back in, like I cited in one of the episodes, where Harley Race body slamming him, or Jerry Lawler beating Andre, like how Vince Sr. just freaking completely went ballistic, right? Even though it was Andre's decision for both of those things to happen. What wasn't Andre's decision was the magazine coverage, and it
Yeah.
getting back to Vince Sr., which would piss Vince Sr. off. Another sighting was him being pictured next to Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt
Yeah.
Chamberlain being 6'9", Andre being not too much taller than Wilt. So Vince Sr. did not like that, and it was his philosophy was, no, a giant should be a giant, and that's how you should be seen.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it was Andre's way of. I think the truth has to lie in the middle. You know what I mean? So
Well, and I think there is that interview with Vince Jr. and Andre where they put Andre on cinder blocks. That's not very subtle. Vince Jr. he's like 6'4", probably.
6'4", yeah, he's every bit 6'4". Yeah,
Yeah, the genetic jackhammer. um, and Andre. So I did try to get hard numbers on Andre. Um, I'm quite certain Andre was not 7'5" or 7'4". I do think he was definitely over 7 feet. Um, uh, I I think I took notes. I was trying to compare to see if I could, meet somewhere in the middle. I think Andre was in between like 7'1" and 7'2". Like, I've read some things that Big Show is not quite 7 feet, but I do think Big Show does legitimately come in over 7. I am certain that Andre was not 7'5". Um, and uh, trying to build that up, and how you build it, putting him with um Big John Studd and people like that, um can kind of mess with the lore of them.
yeah, and again, maybe that was Andre's way of his philosophy, which was brought down by Vince Jr. and Senior. Maybe Andre really was ribbing him, but he has like a weird sense of humor. I don't know what it was. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
I guess we'll never know, because Andre isn't here to defend himself or speak on it. But
Yeah.
he, but it definitely adds to his mystique, if you will. So,
Mhm.
but yeah, WWF, man, they had no shortage of big men in the '80s for sure.
Yeah, like we can go on and on about Andre. I was trying to think of who else was in the scene at that time. um you had King Kong Bundy,
Yep.
who
Who was He was more stout than he was tall, but
yeah.
still he had to have been at least like 6'1" ish, but still
Mhm.
he was 444 pounds at his peak.
Yeah,
And that is a massive human being. And
sure is.
yeah, and I've seen him when he was 444 pounds still, and he was a he was a big stock. Like it was a strange build. It almost looked like what they describe him as Humpty Dumpty.
Yeah.
It's pretty much accurate, I would say. Very Humpty Dumpty type features, you know.
Hmm.
Another one was One Man Gang slash Akeem,
Yeah.
who was 6'9" himself,
Yeah.
and he was a very tall man, boss man, very tall man, and very big man at first, and
Yeah.
then he slimmed down later on, but and looked great. But and when he first came up there in '88, man, he was massive. He was very much pushing 400 pounds
Yeah.
at that, and he was tall as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I think the Twin Towers were very aptly named. Bam Bam Bigelow from this time as well.
yes, and Bam Bam, yeah, again, I mean, he's probably like 6'2", 6'3", but still, he's a big, stocky fella, you know.
I thought he was more like 6'5". No.
Maybe 6'4" to be generous.
Oh.
Um, I only say this because I've been in his presence before, so it's, you know, and I'm I'm eyeballing it, so I'm not the greatest at math. I'm great at estimates for some reason. I'm terrible at math, but I'm standing next to him. I'm like, you know, probably about 6'3", 6'4", I would say.
Yeah. Hmm. Well, and I think the head tattoos added quite a bit. One Man Gang had a lot of tattoos on his head that would later get covered up with
Yeah,
his Akeem gimmick. But
yeah. He had the ones on the side. And he grew out his hair while he was a Keem, so you know, of course, they were covered up, but there was no covering up Bam Bam's flame on his head. But you know what was funny was the flame, the way it was sculpted. If you remember, it was almost like he had a widow's peak, and it was
yeah,
like a receding hairline, but it was flame.
yeah,
You know, very very cool. I haven't seen a wrestler do that since, to be honest.
yeah. No, I've seen some guys with head tattoos, but his was styled to really work
Yeah,
with
and
his look and everything.
I think he got that when he was like 16 or 17 years old, even because
Yeah,
Bam Bam, of course, had a he had a past in a biker gang as well. So you know, before he even was in professional wrestling, you know. But
yeah,
going back, Bam Bam and Bundy, it's funny how they're similar in stature and size. They both were trained at the Monster Factory down in New Jersey. In fact, they were the first. Bundy was first. Bam Bam was second, and of the most famous people ever trained at that Monster Factory. And there's been a ton, but and actually Big Show for a piece trained at the Monster Factory.
I did not know that.
Yep.
I thought
There's
he was right out of the power plant.
no early on he did some stuff at the Monster Factory. He didn't last there very long. Of course, WCW found out about him and, you know, pulled him out of there for that early class. But
Yeah,
yeah, he's a early student of the Monster Factory as well. Probably early '90s. You know.
yeah. All right. So, what does the big man situation look like after Andre? Um, in the WWF, you have the new generation. There's going to be guys like Mabel, um, uh, Mantar, Bastion Booger would be other big guys from that time that I don't really know worked so well.
And on the WCW side, if you remember, they had Vader, which
Yeah.
was their that Vader was the hot hand in WCW, probably the best heel ever they had. That was a world champion in that early '90s period.
Yep.
He was coming fresh from Japan, where he was just dominating everyone, and he came to the States. Nobody had seen that original Vader presentation. Nobody had ever seen anything like that before. Nobody had ever seen a big man do what he did before. Very agile, very not only tall in stature but also very big, you know, and could do a moonsault at 450 pounds, you know, which and he made it look graceful for a guy as some would say very stiff in the ring, some would say clumsy in the ring, some would say rough to work with. But man, you know, when he did that moonsault or he did that Vader bomb or any kind of splash, he looked graceful doing it. you
Yeah.
know. So,
Yeah.
and going back even further, probably early 90s, 1990, 1991, they had El Gigante, which was George Gonzalez, who later
Hmm.
would become the Giant Gonzalez in the new generation of WWF. And he, well, it didn't last very long in the new generation, but he was legitimately 7'6", 7'7",
Yeah.
and was from Argentina, was a stud basketball player in Argentina, and
Hmm.
was brought to the States because, well, Ted Turner owned the Hawks. He owned WCW,
Hmm.
tried out for the Hawks. Of course, he had joint knee problems, and he said, "Well, wait a minute. I also own a wrestling company, and you happen to be really tall. There you go. Do you want a job, kid?" Yep. So, yeah. So El Gigante was sprung upon us in
Yeah.
1990, 1991 time period, and say what you will about his wrestling ability because he didn't have very much, but
Yeah.
traction. He was a very very tall man, and
Yeah.
especially later when you put that Bigfoot suit on him.
Yeah.
It,
There's a lot of really odd looks he had with that suit. And I never really get, but yeah, I mean, he would
personally,
tower over
personally,
Andre.
and personally, I like the fur that he had on, and that was the thing. They brought him in. You think about in the context, 1990, 1991 was a time where Andre was being phased out. He was
Yeah.
doing his final tour in Japan, and he was basically calling it a career for the most part in the ring. And he was supposed to return for Royal Rumble 91, and he never did. So, because his health had gotten so bad, but that's another story for another time. Anyway, he yeah, so they brought him in, El Yante there, and they were like, "Oh, this guy's taller than Andre. He can be the next Andre." Well, what's missing from that is the love of pro wrestling. So
Yeah. And there was
I think in all fairness to George, I Gonzalez, I think he approached it more of a business, like as a business move to come into pro wrestling, as opposed to loving pro wrestling like Andre the Giant did.
yeah.
So,
And
in all fairness, and you know what, you can't knock the guy for that. Kevin Nash did the same thing, another big man in his own right.
yeah.
So, and when somebody comes out and says, "Hey, man, I'm in it because this is a business," you can't really knock the guy for being as limited as they are and using what they have and working with their limitations.
Eh,
You see what I'm saying? You need sometimes they can't all be Bret Harts or Shawn Michaels. Sometimes is my
Yeah.
point. You know,
And when they're not the ones who were coming up with their own creative and booking their matches, you can't really knock the guys for uh, getting to that point, because there should have been somebody that it should have cleared, like, hey, this can be an attraction. Let's try to do this the best way possible, and what would be the best way possible, and then they're given that and have to work with whatever it is.
mm, so I mean, but I think. I mean, again, though, with Nash, yeah, he approaches it as a business, but you could tell he's also loves the business too. It's a strange dichotomy with that guy too. You
Yeah.
know.
Okay, give me one moment.
All right.
Okay, back from these messages. I we didn't get a whole lot into WCW. We were with the WWF at the time, and Andre. Um, Opposite the uh, the business, Vader was very much the monster heel, uh, big guy, bad guy over on WCW.
Yes.
And
One of the few things they got right, I would say, in the early '90s was the push of Vader, and positioning him to be their world champion and be this monster heel. Because you got to remember, even back in the days of Flair, WCW always went heel heavy, and having the babyface chase the heel as the heel being the world champion. They always had the babyface chase.
Yeah.
So unlike WWF, where you had on the other side, you had Diesel being the world champion, who was an ass kicking heel, turning babyface. So it was a big difference, like
Well, and I think when the WWF had Hogan on there, it was run very similar to like the first season of Power Rangers, where every week you had a new uh, monster come up, or like with Voltron too, and
yep.
every week you would tune in to see how the Power Rangers or Voltron was going to take out the new monster bad guy. And in WCW, it was quite the opposite of that.
Yeah. It was always the heel champion with baby faces chasing. And with Hogan, again, it was a different see, and this is why it could have only worked in the 80s, was Hogan's push being as big as it was, because the territory still existed then. And Vince was able to pluck guys from different territories for for these 6 month runs with Hogan and in the house shows. So you can book a Kamala, you can book a Sika, you can book a King Kong Bundy, one man gang, Boss Man. Basically, Earthquake was a different case. He was not a homegrown heel, but by that time the territories had pretty much dried up. So Earthquake was kind of like WWF's answer to like the next monster heel. And
Yeah.
he was very successful, Earthquake, and not a small man by any means.
No.
At 6'4" and four whatever he was, he was again and deceptively agile. I always used to like his power slam. He had a really good power slam. You have to go back and watch it, but he would always tuck the head in, and it was very smooth. I always liked it.
Well,
So
and Tim and I were reviewing the Legion of Doom against the natural disasters, and Earthquake and Hawk were trading off standing drop kicks. Earthquake standing. I mean, even seeing like Animal and Hawk do that, who were obviously some of the most capable, monsters in the ring, whether they were heel or babyface. But then seeing big old Earthquake get that standing drop kick off, that was impressive.
anytime you saw a guy like that was pretty big like that do one, I remember Neidhart doing drop kicks a couple of times and seeing that, and I was like, damn, because Neidhart was a little bit more in shape than I would say like your Earthquakes or your, but whoever you can list whoever, but I was like, oh man, that's impressive, because it looked great, and Earthquake, it probably, man, Animal, and going back to Animal, he had a you remember he had that really good shoulder block move that he would do where he whipped it to the ropes and do that. I always liked his shoulder block a lot.
Yeah,
It just looked very graceful.
you're talking about where he turned himself into kind of like a missile almost.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh, and Hawk was a little more cut in stature, massive. I remember he had a massive, like Sid, he had the massive traps as well up to his ears. But
yeah,
Hawk can do some stuff in the ring. He had a great neck breaker. I remember the neck breaker, just he would just do it, and it was almost like a sack of shit, like neck breaker. You know what I mean?
yeah. He
Like,
would he would
man,
just drop right on his butt and be real firm on the way down, and you just kind of dribbled off him.
yeah. It wasn't like Rude Awakening levels, but it was, I always liked it.
All right. So taking a look at big men, you have Andre,
Hmm.
and then cutting into the Attitude Era and up until very recently, why didn't the Big Show work the same way that Andre did?
Uh, okay, so this
I
is a
know
good question.
Yeah,
And
I know it's not a one-off question, but for all of the people that do get compared to Andre, I think Big Show is the one that comes the closest because of the acromegaly. He
yep.
was billed as Andre's son for a very, very brief minute. And so there's good comparisons. And Big Show, I loved him. It was hard being a Big Show fan because he never won.
Well,
And he was usually embarrassed quite a bit.
yeah. And if you're talking WWE, WWF Big Show, yes. The initial run as the Giant in WCW when I first saw him, and I'm sure you first saw him as well. I
Yeah.
remember he, first night, he was building up to the program with Hogan, and the first night in, he beats Hogan, right, for the world title. It was by disqualification, but he beat him for the world title. But you think to yourself, where do you? Okay, so you just beat Hulk Hogan, and you're pretty much an unknown in the business, but you're really tall, and you're very limited by what you can do in the ring because of how you're being booked. Where do you go from except to be beaten by Hogan? You know what I mean? So I didn't see the end game for him was a very much a losing end game in the beginning. Uh, as time went on, WCW did a little bit better of a job building him up as being a force. I felt better in some cases than WWF ever did, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Um, Especially if you look back, post NWO run in late '96, early '97 into summer of '97. Man, there was nobody more hotter than the Giant, uh, as far as
Yeah.
wins, as far as being built up, as far as being a force.
He had that
Uh,
monster truck match.
oh yeah, same night that he beat Hogan, yeah, and then fell off the roof, and nobody quite knew how he came back. With
Yeah.
nothing on him or whatever, like
That was just chicken shit. There was no salad in sight.
no, that's what I mean. Like when you do something like that, how do you recover really? Except and he, in all fairness to Paul White, the Big Show, he he did try to turn it around a bit. And you remember in '96, early '96, they gave him Flair gave him the rub by giving him the world title.
Mhm.
So world title win. So legitimately. So and he had a good run with it for a while. But again, it was always he was never going to be main event caliber because Hogan always had that spot locked up in WCW. So he was going to work with Hogan, but he was never going to beat Hogan. Is my point. Meaning, with the exception of that first night, he was never going to beat Hogan. And I'm totally convinced Hogan did it only to try to establish the Big Show early on. You
Mhm.
know, my opinion. But and going in between babyface and heel as many times as he has in his career has not done him favors. Also,
Yeah.
the wrestling fans will forget, but we're not as fickle as people like to give us credit for. So you know, you're gonna give somebody this monster push as being the guy. Like let him be the guy. And I don't know. I felt Big Show's career can be summed up to me in WWF, WWE especially, as flashes of brilliance. And when it was great, it was great. When it was awful, holy shit, run for cover because it was fucking bad.
Yeah.
So, um, but I will say this: consistent years of service, did everything that was asked, and
Yeah.
you know what? Having seen him in person, I mean, he was my Giant that I'd seen in person,
Yeah.
and
And that's actually meaningful to hardcore wrestling fans, being able to see someone like that in person and who they are in the
right,
ring and to their era or their generation. That there's a lot of meaning with that.
yeah, yeah, and you know what? And that meaning is not lost when you see him live. I mean, I don't care who you are. and how much you've seen him on television over the years. I mean, he is a massive man, and he now more so than ever is in great shape and can still go. And I think when he completely retires, he's going to be appreciated for who he was more so than. Does that make sense? Like
Yeah.
in comparison to now, where he's active and all that. Um, I, I, I always felt he deserved better, to be honest. But why that never came to be, I don't know.
Yeah. I I've given this a lot of thought, and so I definitely want to kind of pick your brain and see what I can draw out. In many ways, the Undertaker is the Andre the Giant of his era. In fact, in almost every way, in the locker room, in the ring, touring, um, the Undertaker is very much, I believe, the Andre of his generation. And Paul White um, does not like being compared to Andre for the right reasons. I've heard him say, Andre was this, he might have had acromegaly, but he does not put his accomplishments or his career on the level that Andre does, or that he did for Andre, rather. Um,
He's actually Paul White as the human being. In all interviews I've ever listened to and have heard, he's a very humble dude. Like
yes.
like more than he really should be, to be honest. Because man, it's almost like he's not dumbing himself down, but like it's almost like he doesn't feel like he's as good as some guys. When I felt at some points he was better than some guys. In fact, better than most.
Yeah.
But you don't get that sense in talking to him. And but also that speaks of Paul White, the man, who is a very down to earth fella. You know.
Yeah. Yep. And I know he got his own once he had some more success. He got his own bus and bus driver, like a touring bus, because traveling for him was absolutely every bit as uh, troublesome as it was for Andre or and really any guys that even come close to that size. And so I remember when I saw that, I thought that was pretty cool. And um, looking at Taker and Big Show, Big Show's character was routinely reinvented. Sometimes it was a joke, sometimes it was for, I think, a storyline that never panned out. And going back to that mold of Andre the Giant, the Taker's character never really changed. I mean, even the American Badass was not a huge leap from anything he was doing, like the Ministry of Darkness. I thought was way more off the beaten path for him than the American Badass.
Yeah.
And so, do you think because there wasn't that spot open for Big Show that he was kind of relegated to whichever way the wind was blowing? Like he couldn't have the consistency that um, uh, Taker did.
Well, you're with Taker too. You're also talking on top of the man performing the character, Mark Calloway. You're talking a once in a lifetime gimmick, which and it's a gimmick everyone can relate to because we're all gonna freaking die someday. You know what I mean? Like it or not. And he's legitimately a walking corpse when you think about it, right? The original walking corpse is the Undertaker
Yep.
and or cadaver. The original character more looked like a cadaver,
Yeah.
but yeah, he who can't relate to death? You know what I mean? Because we're all going to experience it at one point in our lives, and man, I think that little nuance of the character on top of it being a Vince McMahon creation and
Yeah.
him taking special care of it like he has. Uh, you know what I mean? It was a once in a lifetime character with a once in a lifetime performer, and I don't think anybody else can make it work
Mm.
like he could. because
I completely agree.
he understood it more better than anybody, I think.
Yeah.
And most importantly, he understood what Vince's vision for the character was as well. So, which over time just evolved itself. But yeah, you're right. It still remains very much the dead man. I mean,
Yeah.
I cite one promo where he what was it? He was dressed up. He was the badass, and he said, "I may not dress like it anymore, but I'll still go medieval on your
Yeah.
ass." you know, and I'm still down with the devil.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, like he's
Yeah.
still the Undertaker.
Yeah.
And to interject too about that badass character, real quick, best matches he ever had in his career were as the American Badass, by far. He was doing on Smack. He was putting over everybody on SmackDown. He was. I'm not saying it was him alone. The cruiserweight division had a lot to do with it,
Yeah.
but that brand being as good as it was then, but also understated. Undertaker was a main event level talent, and he was putting over the stars of the future on that set show. Your Snitsky's, your
Yeah.
Heidenreichs, your Luther Reigns, Nate, no, not Nathan Jones, um, uh, John Cena's of the world. You name it, that American badass character was putting over everybody. And because at that point he was established. So what did he have to prove?
Yeah. And
Other
from
than he could still go in the ring. That's it.
yeah, and from what I understand, he hit that point pretty early on in his career, and like the mid to late '90s. He was, that guy. I think like I was trying to draw comparisons between Taker and Big Show, and how Taker had a long lasting run and character. And I didn't mean to say that I thought Big Show could be the Taker. I just think that if you don't know what to do with a giant,
Right.
then you have Shokishi, and getting beat up by Floyd Mayweather and just jobbing the whole time. And so I was trying to see if Big Show had a consistent spot as that giant monster, the way Taker had his spot, if they would have had to have reinvented him the way they
Uh,
did.
they okay. So when he gets signed in late '98, early '99, right? Big Show does, and he gets signed for that big contract that everyone knew about because by then the internet was very prevalent.
Yep.
And you had these high expectations for this guy. I mean, how can he miss? He's legitimately 7 feet tall, and
It's a
he's
400-pound monster.
right. And according to all accounts, he's not being booked right in WCW, and Vince thinks he can do a better job of the Giant. How do you screw up booking a Giant? Well, you know, again, I don't know. Like, even bringing him in, I mean, it was you gotta go back to that first night where he comes up from the cage in that Austin McMahon match, throws
Mhm.
Austin out of the ring. Well, that was a botch. Austin won the match.
Yep.
So like, okay. And then we put him in WrestleMania 15, but he's against Mick Foley to battle for a spot as to be a special guest referee.
Yeah.
That's not booking a giant better.
No.
and
And
that's no disrespect to Mick Foley
of
or
course,
Show. I'm just saying that's where they were placed, and it was awful booking, awful booking, and there was a lot of that in '99. As good as some angles were, there was the awful shit was awful. Not everything in that Vince Russo era was must see TV. You know,
yeah, that is true.
but the early booking of the Big Show being one of them. So, or is Vince to blame? I don't know. The other Vince McMahon. So I don't know. Like what where, or was it the
Yeah.
performer himself? Did he get up there and say to himself, "Holy fuck, am I bad?" Because think about it. He had only been in the business. This was 1999. he had only been in the business for five 5 years up to that point.
Mhm.
For all intents and purposes, made his debut around 94ish. So he goes up to the big time, and Jericho had much of the same problem when he went up there.
That's
As a
true.
lot of performers, like, did they go up there and say to themselves, "Holy," am I bad?" Or "Holy shit, how can I beat Austin and Rock?" Because nobody could. You
Yeah.
know,
And
so I don't know. I don't know if that had something to do with, like, also with the early booking being as bad as it was. You know what I mean? Like, there was a lot of factors that kind of hindered him almost right from the shoot. You
yeah,
know,
yeah. I actually agree quite a bit. I don't think there was a spot for him. And
right?
again, I keep drawing parallels to him and Taker, and it's just for
But in saying that too, even Taker went off the rails a little bit, like you had just said with that Ministry of Darkness stuff, where visually I thought that was really a stretch with the Undertaker character. Here he is all of a sudden just sacrificing people and giving
I
them
know.
different names, and forming a
I
group. And
I dug that though. I thought that was entertaining.
love the look. For production, from a production aspect, it looked. I mean, it's no different than what you see in modern entertainment,
Yeah.
uh, but in a pro wrestling context in 1999, that was just, and this being the jaded attitude era where, now all of a sudden
Yeah,
everyone has the inside scoop on everything and knows everything or think they know everything.
that's
A
true.
character like that's kind of hokey.
Well,
you know
and even so, Taker had a uh, kind of a career run with just Mick Foley, and so those were two guys who I think were made to work together, but in a time where the curtain is starting to be pulled back on the business, and there really isn't, you're starting to see who the man behind the curtain is, and Big Show can't get into that spot that Taker has. I don't think he could have worked with Mick Foley and had the same results at all. But the only other thing to do is put him in the world title picture. If he doesn't have a lifelong nemesis, the way Taker and Mankind had their little relationship, and Rock and Austin aren't going to put this guy over, what's he to do?
you're talking Big Show, right?
Yeah. Sorry.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, we're still
Like
on Big
trying to
Show.
see
Okay.
where Big Show fit in to
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah, yeah. You're at 100% correct. And again, I mean, Rock and Austin were there when WWF was just, they were still like teetering on the edge of bankruptcy, basically, right?
yeah
And here was Big Show on this other show, being, on the successful Nitro show for a couple of years. Big Show was very fond of himself, saying he had kind of had a big head coming in, and had to humble himself pretty quickly.
yeah
So, again, you're not going to get guys that are sewed up in the main event spots to put over this young kid coming from a rival promotion. I don't care how much money the self-preservation on the two main eventer, that's got to come into play, at some point.
yeah, because he wasn't a Chris Jericho who could come over and have those hilarious little one-offs with the Rock on the stick. I really haven't been able to see that there was something for him to do and someone to do it with, and so he does kind of become this silly jobber who's just
Right.
enormous.
And yeah, and he wins the world title by the end of 99. Great, for but what was not so great was, here he was going on first on Monday Night Raw. The world no, first of all, he's a giant. Secondly, he's your world champion. Why is he first on Monday Night Raw? I think the only time he ever main evented a Raw was against Triple H.
Mm.
Triple H beat him for the belt almost immediately. So
Yeah. One of the things that I remember when Big Show was getting ready for his sumo match against Akibono,
Mm,
and he walks out, and there's a Jeep, a real Jeep. It's not gimmicked. And he's rocking it, working himself up, just smacks the windshield, and then he rolls the Jeep. And that was impressive as hell. And then some years later, Braun Strowman shows up, who is a specimen in his own right. My gosh, is he like, he looks the part, and he's, country strong. Now I'm sure
yeah,
he's weight room strong, but he's country strong.
right.
And they have him flip over an 18 wheeler that it's like it just seemed like everything that Big Show could legitimately do was being gimmicked for other people to get over doing. Is that is that accurate?
Yeah, yeah, and going back to show again with and now we're talking where I was talking overexposure with Andre earlier, which I don't want to compare show to Andre, but it's hard not to.
Yeah,
You Here was Andre being overexposed on television back in the 80s, early 90s, right? Big Show even more so because there's even more hours of television and more to speak of at that time, because he had just come off WCW television also. And here he is now on WWF, who was fast becoming a global company. In fact, I believe they went public at the end of '99, October of '99, I do believe they went public. So they all of a sudden, and their fan base has always been humongous anyway, but he's being, you know what I mean, and he's just being treated like he's another guy, which I always felt he shouldn't have, you
yeah,
know. Again, it was just something is amiss with that, you know.
yeah.
And it all starts with that early booking, and no matter how many times they tried getting Big Show on track, it just could not. And he's done a lot of great moments over the years. Don't get me wrong. And
Sure.
I personally, I always enjoyed seeing Big Show live. I've seen Big Show live so many times. I saw him live in '99 even. I was third row in Springfield. I saw him live. Who he faced that night, I have no idea. That escapes me. But I remember he did the choke slam thing, and they had
Yeah.
like little sparkler kind of things. It like real quick. It was like, you know,
Oh yeah, yeah.
like but it wasn't full fireworks. It was just a little sparkler, like, you know. Like somebody had like one of those little party string things, that
Yeah,
that pops out the confetti. It almost reminded me of that,
yeah,
like, or like the Gilbert sparkler, basically. Just think of
yeah,
that. but but yeah, I just, oh, man, I always enjoyed seeing him in different storylines. I wish it was a little more consistent. Um,
his stuff with the Big Boss Man and the Big Show's father is some of the funniest stuff I have ever seen. I mean, I think maybe the two funniest moments in all of wrestling: Big Boss Man in the Big Show, the Big Show's daddy, and Sean and Triple H as Vince and Shane with the stand back in the ring. I don't know. Those are two of the funniest things I've just ever seen. But
And we referenced the Show and Mayweather incident where, Show gets punched, and
yeah,
that whole buildup, which was great because Show's coming back after a year and a half of being off, looks great.
he did look
Um,
great. I
and
think he was
yeah,
under 400 at that point.
yeah, looked fantastic. And here's Mayweather coming out of the crowd, accepting an open challenge from the Big Show, and Big Show gets on his knees, does the punches, and Show sees the blood, throws around, chases him, throws around those 300-pound bodyguards like they were dominoes, like bowling pins, like
That
anything. Like,
that was all shoot right there. That
you
little
know,
moment,
right.
Mayweather can break
And that goes
anyone's
back
nose.
that goes back to what you were saying with the Jeep too. Like, just these moments in time where the Big Show just shows his strength. Um, and we're going to get into Mark Henry soon. And later on, finally, they were consistent with Mark. But I think had they done that same consistency with the Big Show in these different formats, because they always had a good beginning with him, they just the ending never worked out. It always worked out with him being jobbed out, you know.
Yeah.
And a guy like that shouldn't have, you know.
All right. So moving on from there, thank you for indulging me with the Big Show there.
And for the record, I'm still a fan of Paul White. I'll always be a fan of Paul White. Appreciated seeing him live, and he is one of the most underrated talents in the business currently, even today.
Yeah.
They can really let that guy loose, man. He could have, no pun intended, actually very much intended, a giant run in pro wrestling, even at his age right now. He's in great shape.
He is.
Come on, Tony Khan, give him that one run. Let's go.
All right. So rounding up to ruthless aggression into today and there, who else
Yep.
do we see filling a big man role, either a traditional one or a new one? Who do you see as stepping up to be those guys?
Well, pre-ruthless era, if you remember, we had two big men in the form of Kurrigan and the Giant Silva. Uh, both didn't work out. Kurrigan worked out better in the movie 300. He's neck guy. He'll always be neck guy in 300, you know.
And
But
in Sherlock Holmes too.
yes, yes, yes. He's had a hell of a Hollywood run.
Yeah.
You notice most of these big guys I keep talking about today have some inspiration in Hollywood or have had a Hollywood career post pro wrestling. So
Yeah.
it's good to see that they went somewhere.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I met
I'm
Kurgan in the parking lot out in Lowell after a show. He was leaving, trying to get to his car, and me and Tim Elliott were we were out there, and like he did just kind of yell to get people out of his way, and I was just he was enormous. I
yeah,
mean, just enormous.
think he was another 6'10" guy, and something was amiss with that guy. But these were all the pre, and of course they made him. They went from serious with him to goofy real quick. Same with the Giant. Well, Giant Silva was almost goofy right out of the gate, but that guy was tall as hell.
Yeah.
Then we get into Ruthless, and Ruthless was just, you name it. It was, again, we named Snitsky, we named Heidenreich, we named Nathan Jones, we named
Tomko.
Tom Coe. And this was the John Laurinaitis era of recruitment. So of course he was recruiting body guys, like guys that were tall and looked impressive. Luther Reigns was another one.
Yeah.
Um,
Albert.
Albert, yeah, who is not so much. I mean, he's tall, but he's more stocky. You know what I mean? And this is before he waxed all his body hair off. I do believe he was a George the Animal Steel recruit. He was going to be brought in as like kind of like a pseudo relative of George the Animal Steel. And at first, that's why he had all the hair in the beginning, if you remember. So,
yeah. Who was that member of Los Boricuas that had more body hair than even George the Animal Steel did?
Miguel Perez.
Yeah.
What's funny is I work with a lot of Spanish guys, and they know who Miguel Perez is, and they know how hairy he is. And I tell them the story. I always tell them the DX story from Springfield, where they were just brutal to him. They were like, "Shave your back,
Okay.
shave your back." The only crowd to ever do that was Springfield. We're such dicks. So
Massholes.
yeah, massholes indeed. Proud one right here. But yeah, you were there that night. You heard the chants.
Yeah. Yeah. I never got to have many uh many experiences. I did get to see Mania, a couple Monday Night Raws, tons of house shows. The one pay-per-view they had out of Springfield, and I had won third row tickets from the Halloween costume contest, like a couple of weeks before.
Uh,
Like Tim and I went. It was outside, and you could put your name into like a little thing there, and you had they were judging Halloween costumes, I think, and um, I I won and I got the third row tickets. And so I remember when Mark Marrow and Butterbean when they smashed the stool, the seat rolled like right up to the guardrail, and I just went up and grabbed it. It's kind of a lame souvenir, and I have no idea what happened to that, but I thought that was kind of fun.
Yeah, that was the acquaintance of mine, a friend of mine, friend Rich was actually the. If you go back and watch, he was the guy in the hard camera with the screen mask on in the corner. Now, so, and I had no idea this before we even met, so I had no idea that he was that guy. I'm like, and I remember I referenced it years later to him. I said, "Oh, that," because we were talking about old pay-per-views, or old things in Springfield we had been to because we're both fans. And I go, "Yeah, DX. I never went to DX. That was the one show I missed." And he goes, "Oh yeah, I was there." I go, "Yeah, you want to know what bothered me about that? The asshole in the screen mask in the front row." And he's like, "Dude, that was me." I was like, "Oh no." He's like, "Ah, it's okay." So
That's awesome.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I worked with him actually. Weird twist of fate. I worked with him at Strawberries Music years later. So that's how we ended up meeting and telling stories, and then became friends from there.
Yeah,
So
that's a cool little connection.
yeah, 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 yeah. I remember. It's like, who's the asshole with the screen mask? Oh, dude, that was me. Oh, sorry, dude. So, uh, but anyway, yeah. So but the getting back to what we were saying in the Ruthless era, the shining star of that Ruthless era, was the Great Khali, in my opinion.
Really?
And I okay, and not for any wrestling merit whatsoever, because he was never a 5-star guy in the ring at any point in his career, but notoriety. Because think
He
about it,
he killed somebody when he was training.
not only that, he was coming off The Longest Yard, where he played that really tall prisoner, and that got a lot of. I mean, longest that remake of The Longest Yard did some big box office numbers. So,
Yeah.
and a lot of guys from the business were in it, but Kali, who had minimal years experience in the business, or maybe was just even getting into the business, um, did the movie and used the notoriety and exposure to get to WWE. So, and he had that really, really long career, and was taken seriously at first, but again, it was like a Giant Gonzalez situation where look at the guy, he's 7'6", but he's got a lot of joint problems, knee problems, whatever. Yeah, we could put him in the ring with the Undertaker, but he can only do so much. Like Taker, Taker's. I think this is another reason what makes him great, but I'm sure he hates it. Is he's always tasked with trying to put these gigantic men over that
To get
are,
the
are
best out
just
of them that you can.
yeah, and they're just not on his level of greatness. Let's just say. So
Kali definitely looked the part. My gosh, he looks like they just stood a queen pillow top mattress up on end and taught it how to do chops. Kali just, uh, I mean, his hands were huge. His jaw is huge. I mean, he's one of the biggest big men I think that has ever come into wrestling.
and where he is of significance for me is, I mean, come on, he had the Punjabi prison match, and they made a play set out of it, and that sold a lot of play sets, and for love it or hate it, and I mean that match wasn't a great match, but visually, here you have this bigger than life character, you have this bigger than life match with another bigger than life, probably the most bigger, the biggest character ever in WWE history, an Undertaker, like, so your senses are just going, and regardless of how this match turns out, you want to see it, you
Yeah.
know. I know I did at the time.
Hmm.
And I would say he was the shining star of that Ruthless era only because he had the longest lasting career of everybody.
And he did
Everyone felt,
accomplish quite a bit. He won the world title in that battle royal.
yes, yes, he did. And he feuded with a lot of really good talent. Um, where it stopped becoming an attraction and becoming a joke was when he became the Punjabi Playboy. However, it, that as bad as that was, the funny part where Kali was hosting the kiss cam, hilarious
Yep.
because he would just talk in his language and like they would play that saxophone kiss cam music. Oh, funny stuff.
Yeah, he really was entertaining. In whatever they put him in. He definitely was an attraction. He was a spectacle of a big man. Like I said, even against all of the classic big men, he is. It looks like he's like sculpted out of a mountain or something. He's just enormous.
Yes, yeah, and in his bodybuilding days, even bigger. So it's but for again, for what he accomplished in pro wrestling and what he has done, and you gotta put him up there as being love him or hate him as the shining star of the Ruthless era was the Great Khali, my opinion.
Yeah, no,
So
I definitely see that.
yeah,
If I were to ask you right now, who is the guy in that role? Maybe not as physically imposing as Kali or Taker, but in that monster big guy, monster tough guy role. I'm laying the subtlety on real, real thick there. Um, Brock Lesnar got the run that I, I think because of the reality era and the UFC becoming what it has become, like throughout our lifetime. Um, when they say that he is the alpha male of our species, I think I think it was Corey Graves said that if aliens came and invaded Earth and said, here's our champion, send us your champion, it would be Brock Lesnar, and I can't disagree.
no, neither can I. And I'm a huge Brock guy. And let me tell you something. His first run alone would have been a Hall of Fame career. But to come back years later, not only to come back, but to accomplish what he accomplished outside of pro wrestling, which was be basically a walk on to the Minnesota Vikings. Not quite making the team, but not quite not quite losing either. So he
Yeah,
was good enough despite his limited I don't think he had played a football game since he was in high school, and to be uh basically like relegated to secondary team,
yeah,
so to
and
speak.
and
My
and
God,
and I
that
believe he's
speaks
a
to him as
two-time
an athlete.
All-American in wrestling too.
Yes, yes, and it speaks to him as an athlete. I mean, when he dominated in UFC like he did, did, in my opinion, that's what truly put Brock on the map as the alpha male. Because that was seen by arguably way more people saw that. He beat someone legitimate in Randy Couture, and who's as bad can be.
Yeah, he's a silver medalist Olympic wrestler.
Yeah, and his career speaks for itself. But for Brock to get that win and to go on and be the UFC champion, that put him just that elevated him bigger than anything he ever did in wrestling. Never mind this Hall of Fame career that he had within like a few years span in WWE previous during the Ruthless era. And talk about a guy in the Ruthless era coming there being what in his 20s, being jacked in the gills, big traps,
Yeah, he
just
had Sid traps.
yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm dare I say they were bigger than Sid's, to be honest, at some points.
Yeah,
Because this was back when Brock was really heavy on the gas and a lot younger. So he was massive. He was just a massive human being, and again, 6'4" guy. And yeah, he got the monster push, but he is a classic example of a young guy doing it right and being pushed the right way. Um, that whole first run, forget about it. And again, what he accomplished there and outside of WWE, only to come back to WWE. I mean, he never even had to step foot back in the ring, but now he's accomplished more since coming back. And I think now this Brock Lesnar, the Brock Lesnar that we see today in the
Cowboy
flannel,
Brock.
yeah, he looks like a Minnesota Viking. He looks like that is the Brock Lesnar that should be here today. That's probably the most authentic look, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
yeah, I agree. I think this is the definitive Brock Lesnar. Um,
And
and
why it is promos too. Paul Heyman did a lot of the talking for him in those early runs, and now he's comfortable enough to where he can do it on his own, and not only do it on his own, but do convincing promos on his own,
yep,
where he could be funny, he could be serious at a switch, and he, he he's where it's where the character should have been the whole time,
yeah,
and I'm glad it's here now.
yep.
Because
And that's out of all of the big men historically, giants. Um, nobody could knock anybody off their feet. And you're in the Royal Rumble with Brock Lesnar. I can't remember which one. It was at 2019 where he started off and blew through like 18 people before he got eliminated by Drew McIntyre.
yes, yeah, because that was the big push of Drew. Yes, I
Yeah,
remember that.
yeah. And even again, it was kind of a throwback to the older days of wrestling where, knocking a big guy off their feet, you run and bounce and they teeter and everything. And Brock is big. He's another one of those guys that just looks like he really is just carved out of the side of a mountain. Um, but he has the role now and the push now of uh, what a big guy looks like in today's business. You don't need someone who is 7 feet 450 pounds to accomplish the same things that he can do at 6'4", 6'5", 290 pounds. I think that speaks to his accomplishments, but also uh, his his ability all around that just turned him into
Yeah,
the
and
baddest guy in wrestling now.
yeah, and speaking of that Rumble, that Rumble was the first Rumble where you saw the character that you see today, where Brock can be funny but be an ass kicker. Because here he was throughout this entire match, and he was hamming it up for the camera. He was imitating people's entrances. He
Yeah,
was kicking ass, but at the same time, it, it, again, they finally capitalized on it now, but he was doing it in 2019 or
yeah,
might have even been 2020. I don't know, but
yeah. Because like when Shelton came into the ring, he was like, "Oh, hey, we're old college wrestlers and everything," and it's like, "Okay, well, here, yeah." And he was having these little one-offs with each guy that came out, and each one of those little uh, entrances kind of had its own personality.
truly showed his character. And again, it was something he didn't need Paul Heyman for it. He was, and then to further accentuate it, when he won the Money in the Bank, where he had the beatbox and he was
Yeah,
wearing the hoodie and the Brock Party stuff, that was hilarious too.
yeah,
Um, but man, it speaks to the character because and what's funny is a lot of younger fans now, they're like, "Oh, why is Brock in the main event? you barely see him anymore. You know, like you barely see him on television. You barely see him here, there, and everywhere. It's like, yeah, because if you understand pro wrestling at all, he's an attraction. He should be treated as such. Brock knows his value. He's smarter than you think he is.
Yeah.
He knows what he's doing. You know, like I understand it. Being the fan, you know, old school fan, you understand it, but a lot of younger fans do not understand it.
Yeah.
You have to pay to see Brock, you know, and
And
yeah, you
because he
should.
is a part-timer, he's able to keep that price of admission as
Uh-huh.
high as it
And
is.
you should see him. I was happy as shit to see him when I saw him in January, and he was just simply doing a interview with Roman Reigns. You know, title for title interview. That was it, and one segment, one off, yeah, funny, but that's all you saw of him. I didn't see him wrestle that night, but I was happy to see Brock, and but that was cool because that was a highlight of the night for me because I wanted to see these two big men face to face.
Yeah. So looking at the landscape today as well, uh, they have a couple guys kicking around right now that are scary big.
Yep,
Omos gets paired with AJ Styles. You
yep,
you couldn't ask for a better guy to break you into the business, put you over. I mean, that is great. And we have uh
and
Commander.
and, and I'll say it now with time and the right I would say the right storyline, writing, push, whatever, almost can be or almost is it
Yeah,
almost or almost? Uh,
Omos.
almost like two has, right? Um, but yeah, no, but he has potential and he could be a big star. You know, if done right, he could be a big star. So
Yeah. And it is kind of neat how they are going about kind of breaking him in. Pairing him with AJ was good. They had their split. Um and I don't really see, and probably because they're about to, unify the titles. And I think that this is going to be a cataclysmic shift in what the business looks like with Brock and Roman following WrestleMania. Maybe I'm just, marking out for my own conspiracy theories, but um, seeing guys like Omos and everything, these guys they are being booked so much differently than even like Kali was way back,
yeah, and
15 years ago.
and even looking in the main event picture, you have Roman, you have who's not a small man, you have
No,
Drew McIntyre is not a small man either.
no.
You
And
know,
and Roman did play in the NFL.
yeah, yeah, and hell of an athlete, and deserves to be where he is today. And he has progressively gotten better. He has become where it was like X Pac go away heat to now I want to watch what this guy's doing because his character is more interesting now than it's ever been. I would say probably within the last year, and that's a big reason for me tuning back in. Is Roman being on top?
Yeah,
So
yeah. When he was packaged and jammed down everyone's throat, they're just
very similar to how Kevin Nash was as Diesel. He was pushed the same exact way. If they had kept Kevin Nash as the ass kicker Diesel character, I think his world championship run would have been 100 times better than what it was,
yeah.
to be honest. He would still have kick ass matches with Sean and Brett, but I think they would have been different matches. So
Yeah. So what does a big man today look like? Like um Batista. Batista
yes,
was able to walk in later on in life, kind of the same way that Kevin Nash did, was, looked like $1 million, and then he went to Hollywood and became worth $1 million. So I mean,
yeah,
good for
at
him.
least $1 million, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, because even outside of like Guardians, he's a big part of the MCU. Yeah, that's a franchise you want to be a part of. Like
I
there's
you know
there's money there.
And I had said to my girlfriend this. I said, as long as he, okay, so he chooses not to do the Drax character anymore cinematically right now as we speak. He can go to Comic Con circuits for the rest of his life just as the Drax character. But in Hollywood right now, you notice he's being very picky choosy with his roles. You
Mhm.
know, doing the Bond movie was one thing with Daniel
I
Craig.
know. I thought he
He
was great, and he only had a couple minutes there, but I thought he was brilliant.
right doing the movie with Jodie Foster. He's picking
Blade Runner.
Blade Runner, yes. So he's picking and choosing roles that he likes, and I think by doing that, that shows more authenticity with him. It speaks to him as his character, because he's willing to try something different. And think about this: he was in his early 30s when he was just starting pro wrestling. Never mind when he won the world title.
Yeah,
So, probably going on his mid to late 30s by then. So
yeah,
and he has been very fond of saying, just like in pro wrestling, he knows his time in Hollywood is very, very limited. And he knows he can't keep that physique forever, so he's
he's a
trying to get all,
businessman on top of a performer.
yes, yes, yes. And willing to suffer for his art, meaning like, I've heard stories before he got Guardians that he blew through his WWE money just trying to get this acting thing off the ground.
Yeah,
And thank God it worked out for him.
yeah,
Some would say even better than he expected.
yeah. And he was paired. Evolution. Talk about being paired with somebody who can, you can help cut your teeth into business. Um,
You got Triple H on one end, you got Ric Flair, you have Randy as being the young guy, the young up and comer, and Randy was good beyond his years. He's still great now.
yeah,
Um, even in a tag team, I mean, Randy's always good at what he does.
yeah.
Um,
And he had one of those moments like with Sean and Vader with Kofi Kingston.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which they made a storyline out of like many, many, many years later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, what does a big man look like in more recent times in wrestling? What is the role of a big man? Can you have guys like Keith Lee floating around who really do blur the line between is he a big man or it's like is he a cruiserweight? He is so athletic, so athletic for his size.
And I was just about to say the same thing with Otis also, where
Yeah,
he's built like or the Viking Raiders. They're built very thickly, but they can do some deceptively good things in the ring that look very crisp and look great. Keith Lee, another great example. Um, I think the evolution of the athlete now, the athlete is different. It's much like mixed martial arts now, where, and I can compare it to early days of UFC to today's UFC, where you have to be on your game as far as being very well rounded. And this is where I say the athletes in the ring today in WWE or in AEW or any wrestling promotion, um, while some of the storyline writing isn't great, that doesn't take away from the athleticism because as athletes, these guys and girls are so far ahead. It's crazy. You know what I mean? With the stuff that they can do and how they're trained. Um, wow. I compare it to early days of UFC. It's not the days where you have the barroom brawler and the mixed martial artist and the hand-to-hand combat guy and the wrestler guy, and you know what I
yeah,
mean. Now it's these weaving styles that make a guy like a Keith Lee or an Otis just, or even a Kevin Owens, for example, is another good one where they may not be all physically impressive, but you watch them in the ring, they can do some stuff and convincingly and pull it off great. So
yeah. I love that comparison to the early days of UFC. Just very kind of cut and dry, stereotypical, old style, um, uh, uh, different fighters from different genres, and now things are blended quite a bit more. Things I don't like, even again taking a look at like Omas. What is he? He isn't. I mean, he's obviously always acknowledged whenever he comes out for being huge, but that
Yep.
isn't really his marquee. That isn't really the. I don't know, maybe he's a bad example. You talk about how big he is, and he was paired with AJ, but he isn't built or being built as like Kali was or Big Show. Sure, it's a part of his profile and everything, but there really doesn't seem to be that, oh, uh, square peg round hole. No, things can be woven together a lot more in a more useful way, kind of.
Yes. And well, okay. So another good example would be Cass, right? Big Cass, where a couple of years ago they tried to really accentuate him being a giant dude and kind of give him that Kevin Nash kind of rub, right? The
Mhm.
cool giant guy. And uh, he was, and I think we can see this now if you watch his stuff in Impact over the last year. He has evolved in such a way where he is not a Kevin Nash. You know what I mean? Where it's just a couple moves and that's it. He's far beyond. And again, the athletes now more evolved, and it's like comparing apples and oranges, really. Even compared to an athlete today from 10 years ago, from 20 years ago, even you just cannot, the use of like an almost is like an almost
Mhm.
is yeah, I mean, you're pairing him with AJ to be the big heavy, but really, he doesn't look like a giant athlete like, say, your Giant Gonzalez's of the world or Great Khali's, where his knees look like they're about to shake any second. This guy
Yeah,
looks like a guy that can go in the ring and just go potentially, and when given the chance with the right seasoning, he probably could.
yeah.
So,
So I really hadn't thought about that before too, but you can take a look at like the UFC and MMA and see that uh, things aren't so black and white anymore. I mean,
nope,
there really isn't even a classical big man spot anymore today. So you can have these huge guys that come in, but what's demanded of them is uh, it's a lot more complex, and it's a lot more um, they want a more comprehensive wrestler or character or whatever they are. I don't think that you could like Paul White walked on was that size. Kali did work really hard. I think that he did enjoy the business, but we just needed 3 moves, and you could put him out there. I don't think that type of big man role exists anymore.
no, and that's the point I'm trying to emphasize with you greatly is, and we're going to see more of that. NXT also recruited at the same time as Braun Breaker. They recruited that ginormous Brock Lesnar lookalike wrestler. Well, he looks like a younger Brock Lesnar with more tattoos, and this guy is a monster tall, blonde kid, and stud athlete from my understanding. And what's going to be expected of him is a whole nother story. Um, you have I mean, on the AEW front, gosh, where do I where do I start? Maybe like a Brian Cage, maybe a Wardlow, like where they're ginormous dudes. Like Brian Cage, he's a ginormous dude, but he can certainly go in the ring. He's not your stereotypical big muscular guy, you know.
Yeah.
and
Well,
he's more well-rounded, is what I'm saying.
yeah. Well, even looking at Almas, he was trained, in the performance center, but Kevin Nash had a lot to do with his formative training, from what I understand.
Yeah. Uh, yeah, and Kevin Nash is the best person to tell him what to do, what not to do, you know? Uh,
Yeah, he was able to do a lot more with less, and it wasn't because he didn't have what was required. It's because he was a businessman with it. There was a lot more psychology that was needed back then.
and think about it too. He was an athlete himself, a stud basketball star for the University of Tennessee, and then played overseas.
Mhm.
And he had 11 knee surgeries before he even walked into the doors into pro wrestling. Never mind, and still continuously has
Did
knee
he really?
problems. Yes, yes, he did, and still has problems with his knees, his neck, his back, everything today. So, and it speaks to Kevin Nash's athleticism to have as long of a career as he has, because he had to work around those limitations, early on. Never
Yeah,
mind all the injuries that came along with everything else.
that is, that's true. Um, when when we think of like the comprehensive WWE superstar, professional wrestler um, today, we did talk about how you can't just kind of walk on and walk into the business anymore, no matter how impressive you are in one area or another. Um, does that also maybe water down the expectations? Um, you can be a jack of all trades, but like a master of none. Is What do you think is the most whatever they would focus the most on, Omas or Commander Aziz, where they come on, it's your big, but if they really are no different than Otis or Keith Lee, um, how do they train them? Like, what is the WWE business model um, for working like a big man as opposed to coming in from like the indies? And I'm trying to pull a bunch of stuff together to ask a poignant question, but I can't uh, really
Okay, so
kind of form it.
so are you saying like blurring, like where does the line stop with being an attraction and start being with like your total package of a wrestler? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because it seems like the total package is not,
Lex Luger.
yeah, not the 90s gimmick, but that really, like kind of what we've been saying. You can't just walk into the business right now just because you're 7 feet 4 or anything. You can be an attraction, but you need to work on and form your own character. There has to be more creative thought put into it. So I guess to try to put a point or like a bow on the idea of what a big man used to be and what it is now. Um, how are guys supposed to work in the WWE to be a big man? And what would, if you could point to one guy and say this is what a big man is today, he checks all the boxes, who would that be?
Have to be Roman Reigns. Have to be. Have to be. And not just because he's the world champion and not just because he's the top guy. It's because that is a guy who has his package down intact. Big guy, um, very handsome looking, very, very uh, presence wise, sure of himself, um, deceptively athletic, uses that big man thing but also when it's time to pull out the athletic moves, he pulls them out and pulls them out conceivingly.
Yeah.
Um, and does it very, very, very well. Um, Promos, my gosh, they've gotten so much better.
It's like night and day on the stick.
Night and day now. With or without Paul Heyman, they have gotten better. I don't know if that is Roman working on his own promos. I don't know if that's Paul working with him or him working more with creative. I don't know. His presence on camera also very Undertaker-esque, where he knows how to work the camera too and use all the best angles to his advantage. That is very understated, but that is the true presence of a superstar. He has it, you know.
Yeah.
I think Charlotte has it also very much. Just knows how to be a superstar. Just and from out of the gate, you watch television, you're like, I don't know who that person is, but that person's somebody and somebody important. I can draw those two right off the top of my head. And but we're speaking of Roman here, and Roman just my gosh, as a big man, he is what a big man should be measured as right now in the business. Um, uh, and also what helps him too is his lineage, which also, every Polynesian slash Samoan wrestler can work, uh, and he very much knows that, can do it, has proven it, and takes advantage of that.
Yeah.
So that gives him, I think, his edge over everyone else.
Yeah. So let's follow him back to the Shield.
Yep.
He was the muscle of the Shield.
Yep. And
Which,
you knew he was going to be somebody. You just didn't know when. You didn't know where. You, quite frankly, didn't know how much experience he actually really had. Before walking in the door. Because
yeah.
he worked in Florida, but
Well, he was in the NFL. You can tell guys that come from, even if they never made like the opening first string in the NFL. If you could make it onto a team, your athleticism is it is always at a different level.
right. And you can tell with him too. It wasn't that he was a former football player who just fell back into wrestling just because his family was in it. You could tell that he loves the business too, because yes, and he has gone on record by saying he's not long for the business. Maybe he's speaking for as a businessman, maybe he's just predicting his early departure from the business. But I think, honestly, by he he will be around for many years only because there's just nobody else like him and nobody who can get on top of what he's doing right now. And you got to have a love for the business to be at that level and stay at that level. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah, absolutely. So, do you think that the model of a big man has been blended, and now you can be the muscle and still fill the role as a big man, but you need to have a more broad skill set to be able to make it? Like, you can have bigger guys like Otis and Keith Lee. There really isn't that here comes the big man really anymore. Like a little bit, with like Omos, that'll, he's 7'2" or 7'3", legitimately 7'3". So that'll always be, he'll be able to have a couple spots. But I think that we can say, after like everything that you've kind of talked about, I really think that role doesn't exist anymore.
No, and height only gets you so far. Height may get you in the door, but it's your overall athleticism, your attitude, your total take on pro wrestling that's going to make you last. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
Because we've seen many a big men come and go.
Yeah. All right. So uh, play us out. Final thoughts on big men in wrestling, then, now, forever. What do you got?
Just that there's always going to be a place for big men in pro wrestling. You're again, it's one of those things where no matter in life, you're gonna run across somebody who's really tall, or you're gonna run across somebody who's really big, or you're gonna run across somebody even on the other side who's really tiny. The one thing these all have in common is you're gonna always turn your head and look. And you know that there's always going to be a place for that. The start was not where the finish line is, and I don't even think we have a finish line right now. I think Roman is just one part of that like the evolution of the evolution, and we're going to be talking 10 years down the line of the evolution of Roman and the next guy, you know, like who's going to be even more evolved than Roman is. I hope. Uh, that's my hope anyway as a fan. And we're going to see this go on and on and on and on. My point being is uh, any attraction in wrestling, they're there for a reason. They're not there to fill space. They're not there to whatever. They're there because they are what they are. They're an attraction. So
Perfect. All right. Thank you.